The airport went quiet the moment the pilot stopped walking. Just seconds earlier, no one had noticed the woman standing in the priority check-in line. She held a small black suitcase, shoulders relaxed, waiting patiently while the line slowly moved forward. She wasn't loud. She wasn't demanding. She didn't try to prove she belonged there. But the airline worker behind the counter had already decided something about her. When it was finally her turn, he barely looked up. He glanced at her ticket, frowned, and pushed the documents back across the counter with visible irritation. "Ma'am," he said loudly, "this line is for priority passengers. If you're not in the right place, step aside so we can help people who actually belong here." A few people in line shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered. The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded once and moved her suitcase aside as if the moment didn't matter. And it probably would have ended there. Another rude airport interaction no one would remember. But then a voice came from behind the crowd. "Excuse me." A pilot had just stepped out of the staff corridor. He froze when he saw the woman. For a second, he looked confused, like he was seeing a ghost from a memory he hadn't visited in years. Then his expression changed. Shock, respect, and something close to disbelief. He walked straight toward her. The airline worker frowned, irritated by the interruption. But before he could say anything, the pilot spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ma'am, I can't believe it's really you." The terminal fell silent. Because the woman that employee had just pushed aside was the same woman who had trained half the airline's senior staff. And in the next few minutes, that airport worker would realize he had just disrespected one of the most respected mentors in the airline's history. But the part that would leave everyone stunned was how the woman chose to respond. Before we take you back to the moment this story really began, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And as you listen, ask yourself one thing. If you had seen her standing there with that small suitcase and calm face, would you have recognized greatness? Or would you have made the same mistake he did? Because what happened in that airport line is a lesson many people never learn until it's too late. Airports have a strange way of revealing people. Not the polished versions they show at weddings or in family photos, not the confident voices they use at work. Airports reveal the hurried version of people, the impatient version, the stressed version, the version that forgets to be kind. And on that particular morning, Terminal C was full of those versions. Announcements echoed through the high ceilings. Flight 728 to Chicago now boarding Group B. Suitcases rolled across the tile like distant thunder. Children whined. Coffee machines hissed behind crowded counters. Business travelers stared into their phones as if the glowing screens were the only real thing left in the world. It was the kind of morning where no one really saw anyone else, except perhaps for a woman standing quietly in the priority check-in line. She had arrived earlier than most passengers, but she didn't rush to the counter the way others did. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on the handle of a small black suitcase. Her coat was modest, her shoes practical, her posture calm. If someone had glanced quickly in her direction, they might have assumed she was a grandmother traveling to visit family somewhere warm. And in some ways, that assumption wouldn't have been entirely wrong. But it also would have missed almost everything that mattered. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter. And if someone had looked closely, really closely, they might have noticed something unusual about her stillness. It wasn't the stillness of someone nervous about flying. It wasn't the stillness of someone lost or unsure of what to do. It was the kind of quiet composure that comes from a lifetime spent in high-pressure environments, where panic is a luxury no one can afford. But of course, no one was looking closely. The man standing behind her certainly wasn't. He checked his watch loudly, sighing in frustration as if Evelyn had personally delayed the entire airline. "Unbelievable," he muttered to no one in particular. "Some people just don't understand how lines work." Evelyn glanced over her shoulder briefly, offering the man a polite smile. He didn't smile back. He simply stepped around her, deliberately, confidently, and planted himself directly in front of her spot in line. Evelyn didn't protest. She just adjusted her suitcase and stepped half a pace back. Across the terminal, a woman watching the interaction whispered to her husband, "Did he just cut in front of her?" The husband shrugged. "It's the airport," he said quietly. "People do that." And unfortunately, he was right. Another passenger slipped ahead a moment later, then another. It happened so quickly that Evelyn's place in line seemed to dissolve entirely. Within 10 minutes, 4 people who had arrived after her now stood between her and the counter. Still, she didn't complain. She didn't raise her voice. She simply waited. The airline worker behind the counter, however, was not having a patient morning. His name was Kyle Benton, and he had already decided the day was going to be terrible. 2 flights had been delayed, a baggage system glitch had slowed down check-in, and the last passenger he'd helped demanded an upgrade he couldn't give. So when the next traveler stepped forward with a complicated reservation, Kyle's irritation grew sharper. "Sir," he said with forced politeness, "you booked basic economy. That doesn't include priority services." The man argued. Voices rose. A line began forming behind him. By the time the situation was resolved, Kyle's patience had completely evaporated. He rubbed his forehead, exhaled loudly, and waved the next passenger forward. And that was when Evelyn finally stepped up to the counter. Kyle barely looked at her. "Boarding pass," he said. She handed over her documents calmly. For a moment, Kyle studied the screen in front of him. His eyes flicked up, then down again, then back up. His expression tightened. He looked at the line behind her, then back at Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this is the priority check-in lane." Evelyn nodded. "Yes," she said gently. Kyle tapped the counter with his pen. "You need to move to the regular line." There was a small pause, not long, just long enough for the people nearby to notice something uncomfortable forming. Evelyn glanced behind her. The regular check-in line stretched halfway across the terminal. Families, students, a tired couple arguing quietly over luggage weight. It was easily 40 minutes long. "I understand," Evelyn said calmly, "but my ticket—" Kyle pushed the paper back toward her without reading further. "Ma'am," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly, "this line is for priority passengers, business class, status members, people who actually belong here." A woman 2 spots back inhaled quietly. The tone had shifted. Evelyn didn't react immediately. She simply looked at the young employee for a moment. Not angrily, not defensively, just thoughtfully. Then she said something very simple. "My ticket should indicate my status." Kyle didn't check again. He had already made up his mind. "You can argue about it," he said impatiently, "or you can step aside so I can help the next passenger." A few people behind her shifted awkwardly. Someone whispered, "That was rude," but no one intervened. And that perhaps was the saddest part, because moments like this happen all the time. A stranger is spoken to harshly, a quiet person is dismissed, and everyone nearby feels uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak. Evelyn picked up her document slowly. For a moment, it looked like she might say something else, but instead she nodded once. "Very well," she said softly. She stepped away from the counter. The next passenger rushed forward immediately. Kyle had already forgotten her. He had moved on to the next problem. "Passport," he said sharply. But across the terminal, a different set of eyes had just noticed something unusual. Captain Marcus Hale had just finished reviewing a flight report in the staff corridor when he glanced toward the check-in counters. At first, he wasn't looking for anyone in particular. But then, he saw her. A small figure standing near the edge of the terminal. A woman holding a black suitcase. Quiet. Still. Watching the crowd with patient eyes. Marcus stopped walking. For a moment, he wasn't sure why. Something about the woman felt familiar, not in the way strangers sometimes look like people you know, in a deeper way, the kind that tugs at old memories. He studied her again. Silver hair, calm posture, a thoughtful gaze that seemed to take in everything without drawing attention. Marcus's brow furrowed. "Wait," he murmured. Another pilot walking beside him noticed. "What's wrong?" Marcus didn't answer right away, because the memory was arriving slowly now, like a page turning in a book he hadn't opened in years. And suddenly, his heart skipped. "No way," he whispered. He stepped forward into the terminal. Across the room, Evelyn Carter adjusted the handle of her suitcase and turned slightly toward the seating area. She still had no idea that someone was watching her, and she certainly didn't expect what was about to happen next, because in just a few seconds, Captain Marcus Hale would realize exactly who she was, and the moment he spoke her name out loud, the entire terminal would begin to change. Captain Marcus Hale didn't move for several seconds. Across the busy terminal, people continued rushing toward gates, checking their phones, adjusting their luggage straps, living inside their own small worlds of travel stress. But Marcus stood completely still. The woman near the seating area had just turned slightly, and the light from the terminal windows touched her face in a way that made something inside his memory click into place. He knew that face. Not the way someone recognizes a celebrity or a politician. The recognition ran deeper than that. It was the kind that carries weight, respect, gratitude, and a quiet shock that someone from a different chapter of your life has suddenly stepped back into the present. Marcus took a few slow steps forward. His fellow pilot, Jason, noticed immediately. "Hey," Jason said quietly, "what's going on?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the woman, still trying to confirm what his instincts were telling him. "You see that woman over there?" Marcus asked. Jason glanced toward the seating area. "Which one?" "The one with the black suitcase." Jason squinted slightly. "She looks like somebody's grandmother waiting for a flight," he said casually. "Why?" Marcus exhaled slowly, because the more he looked at her, the more certain he became. And if he was right, what had just happened at that check-in counter was about to become the most uncomfortable moment of someone's career. "That's not just somebody's grandmother," Marcus said quietly. Jason frowned. "Then who is she?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward her. Each step felt strangely heavy, because if he was right, he wasn't just approaching a former colleague. He was approaching someone who had shaped a large part of his career. Someone who had once stood in front of a classroom filled with young trainees and said something Marcus had never forgotten. "Confidence is not loud," she had told them. "Real confidence is the ability to stay calm when everyone else is losing their head." Marcus remembered the way the room had gone quiet when she said it. Even the cocky trainees had stopped talking, because when Evelyn Carter spoke, people listened. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand attention. She simply carried a presence that made you want to hear what came next. And now she was standing in the middle of a crowded airport, like no one had ever heard her name before. Marcus approached slowly. He didn't want to startle her. He didn't want to be wrong. But the closer he got, the clearer the truth became. It was her, older now, her hair fully silver, lines of experience around her eyes, but the same calm expression, the same quiet awareness of the world around her. Marcus stopped a few feet away. For a second, he felt like the young trainees he used to be. Then he spoke. "Ma'am?" Evelyn turned. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Marcus felt a sudden lump in his throat, because recognition appeared in her eyes too. It took a second, then two, and then a small smile appeared on her face. "Marcus Hale," she said softly. Jason blinked in shock behind him. Marcus let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. "You still remember me?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "You were the one who asked too many questions in class," she said. Jason's eyebrows shot up. Marcus shook his head, smiling now. "I asked good questions." "You asked complicated questions," Evelyn corrected gently. Jason stepped closer. "Okay," he said, glancing between them. "Clearly, I missed something important." Marcus turned to him. "This," he said carefully, "is Evelyn Carter." Jason waited. Nothing clicked. Marcus shook his head slowly. "She ran the airline's advanced training program for 15 years. Jason's eyes widened slightly. Marcus continued. "She helped redesign our emergency response protocols." Jason blinked again. Then Marcus added something that made Jason's posture change completely. "And she trained half the captains flying today." Jason's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked back at Evelyn, then back toward the check-in counter. "Wait," Jason said slowly. "You mean the woman they just pushed out of the priority line?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Yes." Jason let out a low whistle. "Oh, that's bad." Across the terminal, Kyle Benton had just finished helping another passenger. He glanced up briefly and saw something he didn't understand. Two pilots standing with the woman he had dismissed earlier, talking to her, listening to her. Kyle frowned slightly. He shrugged it off. Probably just passengers asking for directions. But Jason was already walking toward the counter. "Jason," Marcus said quietly, "you're not seriously going to let that slide, are you?" Jason asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately because he wasn't angry. Not yet. He was thinking about the way Evelyn had stepped aside earlier, thinking about how calmly she had accepted the insult, thinking about something she had once told their training group years ago. You can learn more about a person's character from how they treat strangers than from anything they say about themselves. Marcus turned back to Evelyn. "Did that employee speak to you like that?" he asked carefully. Evelyn looked toward the counter. Kyle was helping another traveler now. She sighed lightly. "It was a busy morning," she said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's not what I asked." Evelyn gave him a patient look. "You're still very protective," she said. Jason laughed softly. "You have no idea," he said. Marcus shook his head slightly. "You shouldn't have been treated that way." Evelyn studied him for a moment. Then she said something that surprised both pilots. "Marcus," she said quietly, "do you know what the most important lesson in aviation is?" Marcus blinked. "You taught us that lesson," he said. She nodded. "And what was it?" Marcus thought for a moment. Then he said it. "Stay calm when others lose their composure." Evelyn smiled. "Exactly." Jason leaned closer to Marcus. "She's way calmer than I'd be right now," he whispered. Marcus glanced toward the counter again. And that's when something else happened. The terminal supervisor walked past. He noticed the pilot standing there. Then he noticed Evelyn. Then his eyes widened, because he recognized her too. He stopped mid-step. "Miss Carter?" he said in disbelief. Kyle looked up from the counter. He saw the supervisor. He saw the two pilots. And suddenly, something in his stomach dropped, because the supervisor never looked nervous, but right now, he did. Kyle watched as the supervisor walked directly toward the woman he had dismissed, and when the supervisor reached her, he did something that made several nearby passengers turn their heads. He shook her hand, with both hands, respectfully. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, "I had no idea you were traveling today." Kyle's face slowly lost its color, because in that moment, he realized something very uncomfortable. The quiet woman he had just pushed out of the priority line was not just another passenger, and the next few minutes were about to make that painfully clear. The terminal supervisor's handshake lasted only a few seconds, but in an airport, a few seconds can feel like an eternity, especially when something unusual begins unfolding in front of a crowd. Passengers nearby had already started noticing. First, it was the way the supervisor approached the quiet woman. Then it was the respectful tone in his voice. Then it was the way two pilots stood beside her like students waiting for instructions. Small details, but small details are how people sense that something important is happening. Kyle Benton noticed too. At first, he tried to ignore it. Airports are full of distractions, and the last thing a check-in agent wants is to lose focus when a long line of impatient passengers is staring at him. But when he looked up again, the supervisor was still there, still talking to the woman, still smiling in a way that didn't look casual. Kyle felt a tightness in his stomach, because there are moments in life when your instincts start whispering that something isn't right. And Kyle's instincts had just started whispering. "Next passenger," he said quickly, scanning a boarding pass, but his attention kept drifting. The supervisor was now speaking to Captain Marcus Hale. Kyle couldn't hear the words, but he could see Marcus nodding. Then something even stranger happened. The supervisor turned toward the counter and looked directly at Kyle. Not angrily, not loudly, just very carefully. Kyle's hand froze over the keyboard. The passenger in front of him cleared his throat. Is everything okay?" Kyle blinked. "Yes, sir," he said quickly, forcing a smile. But his focus had already shattered. Across the terminal, the supervisor finished speaking with Evelyn Carter. He stepped aside slightly. Marcus leaned closer to her. "Did you tell them?" Marcus asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "No." Jason chuckled softly. "You really haven't changed." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I should hope not." Jason smiled. Most people would have corrected him the moment he pushed them out of the line. Evelyn's expression softened. "I didn't need to." Marcus crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You knew someone would recognize you." Evelyn shook her head again. "No," she said gently. "I didn't." Jason looked confused. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Evelyn glanced around the terminal. People were starting to notice now. Some had stopped pretending not to watch. She spoke quietly. "Because sometimes," she said, "the way people treat you when they think you're unimportant tells you more than anything they say when they think you matter." Marcus nodded slowly. He remembered that lesson. Evelyn had said something similar during a training session years ago. Back then, the room had been filled with young recruits who believed aviation was mostly about machines and procedures, but Evelyn had taught them something different. People, human judgment, human behavior under pressure, human character. Those were the things that kept airplanes safe. And right now, Marcus realized something. Evelyn wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was simply observing. Observing the terminal. Observing the employees. Observing how people behaved when no one believed they were being evaluated. Meanwhile, Kyle was starting to sweat. The line at the counter had slowed. He couldn't help it. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the group across the terminal. And what he saw made the uneasiness grow stronger. More airline staff had joined them. A flight attendant, another pilot, someone from operations. Each of them greeted the woman with the same expression: surprise, respect, recognition. Kyle's heart thudded harder, because there's a very specific kind of dread that begins when a person realizes they may have misjudged someone important. He tried to reassure himself. Maybe she's just a frequent traveler. Maybe she's a company VIP. Maybe... But then the terminal supervisor started walking back toward the counter. Kyle straightened immediately. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. The supervisor stopped in front of him. "Kyle," he said calmly. "Yes, sir." The supervisor glanced briefly at the line behind Kyle. Then he leaned closer. "Do you remember the passenger you asked to leave the priority line a few minutes ago?" Kyle felt the blood drain from his face. "Yes, sir." The supervisor studied him. "Did you check her ticket?" Kyle hesitated. "I glanced at it." The supervisor sighed quietly. "You didn't check her status." Kyle swallowed. "No, sir." The supervisor looked over his shoulder. Evelyn was still standing near the seating area with Marcus and Jason. Several other crew members had joined them. The supervisor turned back. "You might want to take a moment and look at the name on that ticket." Kyle's throat tightened. The supervisor placed the boarding documents gently on the counter. Kyle stared at them. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he picked them up. The name printed across the top was simple: Carter, Evelyn. At first, it meant nothing. Then he noticed something else: a notation, a designation he had never personally seen before. A status code reserved for a very small group of individuals connected to the airline's history. Kyle blinked. "What is this?" The supervisor folded his arms. "That," he said quietly, "is someone who helped design the training program this airline still uses." Kyle felt his stomach drop. The supervisor continued. "She worked here long before you were hired." Kyle stared at the ticket. The supervisor leaned closer. Half the senior captains flying today were trained by her. Kyle slowly lifted his eyes. Across the terminal, Evelyn Carter was speaking calmly with Marcus. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She simply looked patient. The supervisor's voice softened. "You pushed her out of the line." Kyle's face flushed. "I didn't know." "I know," the supervisor said. And then he added something that made Kyle's chest tighten even more. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who she was." Kyle blinked. The supervisor met his eyes. "The problem is how you treated someone you thought didn't matter." Kyle had no answer, because deep down, he knew the supervisor was right. Across the terminal, Marcus was finishing a conversation with another pilot. The man had just said something that made Evelyn laugh softly. Jason watched the interaction. "You realize," Jason said to Marcus quietly, "this story is about to spread through the entire terminal." Marcus nodded. "It already has." Jason glanced toward the counter. Kyle was staring down at the ticket. "You think he understands yet?" Marcus watched Kyle for a moment. "Yes," he said. Jason crossed his arms. "Good." Evelyn looked between them. "You're both very serious." Marcus smiled faintly. "We just don't like seeing people treated poorly." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Then perhaps this will be a useful lesson." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For him?" Evelyn shook her head gently. "For everyone." Jason looked confused. "What do you mean?" Evelyn glanced toward the passengers who had started whispering among themselves. Then she said something quietly. "Sometimes people need to see a moment like this to remember how they should treat strangers." Marcus nodded slowly. He had a feeling she was right. But neither of them realized yet that the next few minutes were about to turn this uncomfortable airport moment into something much bigger. Because the general manager of the entire terminal had just been notified, and he was on his way. When he arrived, everyone in that terminal, including Kyle, would learn exactly who Evelyn Carter really was. News travels quickly in airports, not through announcements or official messages, but through whispers, Small pieces of information passed from one employee to another until suddenly everyone seems to know something important has happened. And by the time the terminal's general manager stepped out of the administrative corridor, the whispers had already begun spreading. The story sounded different depending on who told it. Some said a passenger had been mistreated. Others said a senior airline mentor had been disrespected. One flight attendant simply said, "You need to come see this." The general manager, Robert Langford, was not a man who enjoyed surprises in his terminal, especially not surprises involving staff behavior. As he walked across the terminal floor, his eyes quickly found the small gathering near the seating area. 2 pilots, a supervisor, 3 crew members, and in the center of them all stood a quiet woman with silver hair holding a black suitcase. Robert slowed his pace because the moment he saw her face, recognition hit him instantly. "Oh no," he murmured under his breath. He approached carefully. "Miss Carter?" Evelyn turned, and her warm, patient smile appeared again. "Good morning, Robert." The general manager exhaled in disbelief. "Good morning," he said softly. "You're standing here in the middle of a situation that should never have happened, and you're wishing me a good morning?" Evelyn chuckled lightly. "I'm still having one." Marcus and Jason exchanged a glance. Robert rubbed the back of his neck. "I just heard what happened at the counter." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked across the terminal toward the check-in desk. Kyle Benton was still standing there, but he wasn't processing passengers anymore. He was simply waiting. Waiting with the uneasy stillness of someone who knows something serious is about to happen. Robert followed her gaze. Then he sighed. "Would you mind walking with me for a moment?" Evelyn nodded politely. "Of course." The small group began moving toward the counter, and something fascinating happened as they walked. Passengers noticed. Employees noticed. Conversations quieted. People moved slightly aside as the group passed, because even though most of them still didn't know the full story, they could feel the weight of the moment. Kyle saw them coming. His hands tightened slightly on the counter. The line of passengers behind him had grown unusually quiet. Some of them had already heard fragments of the story, and now everyone seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. Robert stepped forward first. "Kyle." "Yes, sir." Robert's voice was calm, but it carried the kind of calm that makes people stand a little straighter. "Do you know who this is?" Kyle swallowed. "Yes, sir." Robert raised an eyebrow. "And who is she?" Kyle hesitated. His voice came out quieter than usual. "Miss Evelyn Carter." Robert nodded slowly. "And do you know why that name matters to this airline?" Kyle glanced briefly at Evelyn. She wasn't staring at him. She wasn't angry. She simply stood there patiently, and somehow that made it harder. "She helped build the training program," Kyle said. Robert nodded again. "That's correct." A long pause followed. Passengers nearby were pretending to check their phones, but every ear was listening. Robert spoke again. "Kyle, I want to ask you something." "Yes, sir." "If Miss Carter had been just another passenger, would the way you treated her have been acceptable?" Kyle's shoulders sank slightly. "No, sir." Robert's voice remained steady. "That's the part that matters." Kyle nodded. "Yes, sir." Another quiet pause. Then Robert turned to Evelyn. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "I want to apologize on behalf of the airline." Evelyn shook her head slightly. "You don't need to do that." Robert looked surprised. "I believe I do." Evelyn smiled softly. "Robert, airports are stressful places. People are tired, employees are under pressure. Mistakes happen." Marcus folded his arms thoughtfully. Jason whispered quietly, "She's being kinder than most people would be." Robert turned back toward Kyle. Kindness doesn't erase responsibility, he said. Kyle nodded again. I understand. Robert gestured toward the counter. Kyle, step away for a moment. Kyle obeyed immediately. The supervisor took over the desk. Robert lowered his voice slightly. This will be addressed through proper channels. Kyle looked relieved and ashamed at the same time. Thank you, sir. But before the moment ended, Evelyn spoke. Robert? Yes? She looked at Kyle, and her voice carried that same calm authority Marcus remembered from the training rooms years ago. Kyle, she said gently. He looked up. Yes, ma'am? Can I ask you something? Of course. When you looked at me earlier, what did you see? Kyle hesitated. I thought you were someone in the wrong line. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. That's honest. Then she said something that made several people nearby look up from their phones. Next time, she said softly, look a little longer. Kyle blanked. Ma'am? Evelyn smiled. Because the world is full of people who look ordinary at first glance. Marcus nodded slowly. Jason murmured quietly, That's true. Evelyn continued. And sometimes those ordinary people carry stories you can't see yet. Kyle lowered his eyes. I understand. Evelyn picked up her suitcase. Well then, she said lightly, I suppose I should check in for my flight. The supervisor quickly stepped forward. Miss Carter, please allow me. Within seconds, her boarding pass was printed, her luggage was tagged, and for the first time that morning, the entire check-in area felt calm again. But before she left, Marcus spoke. Miss Carter, she turned. Yes? I just wanted to say thank you. For what? For everything you taught us. Evelyn's eyes softened. You did the hard work, she said. Then she began walking toward the security checkpoint. Passengers moved aside as she passed, not because she demanded it, but because respect had quietly replaced curiosity. Marcus watched her go. Jason leaned beside him. You know, Jason said quietly, that could have gone very differently. Marcus nodded. Most people would have been furious. Jason shrugged. Most people aren't Evelyn Carter. Marcus smiled faintly. And across the terminal, Kyle Benton stood silently behind the counter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was simply thinking. Thinking about the way a quiet woman had handled humiliation with dignity. Thinking about the way respect had spread through the terminal once people understood who she was. And thinking about the uncomfortable truth Robert had pointed out earlier. The real problem wasn't that he didn't know who she was. The real problem was how he treated someone he believed didn't matter. Sometimes the most powerful kind of justice isn't loud. It doesn't come with shouting. It doesn't come with revenge. Sometimes justice simply arrives as a moment of clarity, a moment when someone realizes who they've been and who they need to become. Evelyn Carter disappeared into the security line. The terminal returned to its usual noise. Flights continued boarding. Passengers hurried toward their gates. But a quiet lesson lingered in the air. A lesson many people in that terminal would remember long after the flights had taken off. Because respect should never depend on status, and dignity should never be reserved only for those whose names we recognize. The truth is, every stranger we meet carries a story we cannot see, and sometimes the person standing quietly in line beside us is someone extraordinary. So let me ask you something. If you had been standing in that airport that morning, would you have recognized Evelyn Carter? Or would you have made the same mistake Kyle did? What do you think happened next? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and share it with someone who believes in treating people with respect, no matter who they are. Subscribe for more real-life twists and powerful stories like this one. And if you thought this moment was surprising, Wait until you hear what happened in the next case.